Your studies for the bar exam. That's not unusual, and I know it feels bad, but it doesn't have to be that way. Instead of feeling despair, if you could feel hope, that would be a lot better, wouldn't it? And it's what we're going to show you in this upcoming video, how to move across the bridge from despair to hope when you study for the bar. I know the process is difficult, but I've helped thousands of people cross that bridge over the last 30 years as I've helped them study for their bar exams. So stay tuned and we'll show you how to make that journey. We're going to talk about bridges today. And not the kind of bridges that take you from one part of the bay to the other, although that's a heck of a bridge, isn't it? We're going to talk about the bridge that happens for bar takers. The bridge today that we're going to talk about is the bridge from despair to hope. And in later episodes and videos, we're going to talk about the bridge from hope to belief, and then from belief to expectation. And the reason that I wanted to talk about these bridges is that I think it's the journey that bar takers often have to follow. And it can be confusing and frustrating when you're in the midst of it. You may think you're never going to get there, but in point of fact, you can do it. And you can do it by working through in stages from one bridge to the next to the next. And that's something that I've learned in working with thousands of bar takers over the past 30 years to help them pass their bar exams. And I want to share some of that with you today. I thought that we'd begin in this video by briefly looking at where an awful lot of bar takers start, and that's at the position of despair. You know, recently, one of the publications in law put together a print episode in which they titled The Best Bar Reviews in America. And to my surprise, we were not listed in that edition. And so I contacted the publisher and I said, a little surprised that Celebration Bar Review isn't in that list. I mean, we've got a terrific track record. We've been around a long time. You know me. And he said, oh, no. He said, it was nothing like that. He said, I didn't have a lot of space. And so I only wanted to talk in the print edition about bar reviews that work with first-time bar takers. And he said, actually, we think of you as being the premier bar review for repeat bar takers. And so we're going to do a special online version where we talk about that. And we highlight what we think are the 3 best bar reviews in the country for repeat bar takers. Well, I guess I was pleased with that. I'm not sure, but maybe he was just trying to suck me out of more ad dollars. I'm not sure. In any event, I thought it was an interesting perception that what we try to do at Celebration is to work with students who are moving into a repeat setting. And for many of those students, they are at one end of a very long bridge, and that beginning of that bridge is the bridge of despair. When I talk to people who failed the bar exam, whether it's once or many times, there's some things that I see in common, and maybe you've experienced this if you've taken the bar and not been successful. For some people, there's a lot of anger, and that can be anger at themselves, anger at their school, anger at their bar review, anger at the situation, anger at the bar examiners, you name it. It's just generalized anger. There's also a great deal of frustration. It's hard to know how to be successful when everyone's got a different theory or a different approach, when you hear so much from so many different people and so many different institutions and schools and bar reviews. And what are you supposed to do? And so people get frustrated. There's also an extraordinary amount of discouragement. The pass rates in the bar exam in recent years are at the lowest that they've ever been. This is a very hard time to take a bar exam. When I started teaching bar 30 some years ago, virtually everyone passed their exam. It just was a given. You go to school, you take your bar exam, and you pass. Today, it's almost inverted. Today, the assumption is you won't pass on your first try, and that's obviously frightening and discouraging. And for a lot of people, it's just incredibly infuriating to be in that position, to have invested the time and the money, and then what they describe to me is having their life on hold. It feels like everything stops while you wait to pass the bar exam. You have to study, you can't move on with your career. It seems like your family and friends and every part of your life suddenly gets put on hold. And it has to stay there until you pass the exam. And so the despair mounts as you realize that the bills don't go away and the demands on your time and your life don't go away. If you've got children, they're growing up, and spouses and family and friends move on, and you're stuck really in a time warp. And so that sense of having your life on hold becomes very real for a lot of bar takers in that situation. And then I think for a lot of bar takers who are experiencing despair, there's a sense of overwhelm. As I said, there's a lot of information that comes at you, and much of it is contradictory. And so you get really just sort of too much. I was talking to a bar student the other day, and she was showing me all the different books and materials that she had and information she'd gotten from friends and school and others, and it was just a massive pile. And my advice to her was, put it all away. You don't need all of that. You don't need to be overwhelmed. Having another set of books and another set of lectures and another something on top of everything else is not going to work. You have to pick something and go with it. But I think a lot of bar takers at this point feel overwhelmed, and maybe you've experienced that as well. And in that overwhelm comes a great deal of frustration. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to do it? When we ask students who are coming through our webinar on doing something different, what it is that keeps them from being successful on the exam, it's fascinating to hear their responses. Often they say things like, well, I just don't know how to memorize enough, or I can't remember everything, or I can't get it all in my brain, or I don't have enough time. And the list goes on and on and on. But really the subtext to all of that is enormous frustration. Frustration with how to get through this process. It seems like a mystery, and it seems like a mystery that can't be solved. And as a result, the sense of a lack of control that I think people feel in their lives at that point is huge. And so that frustration, I think, is something that you've really got to be aware of and recognize that it's there and it's quite real. I also hear students who are in this situation feeling despair, talking about the amount of their investment. They've obviously invested a lot of money in law school, in their careers, certainly invested money in bar review courses or tutors or mentors, but they've also invested time. Months and months, years and years. They've given up holidays and weekends and special events. They've literally had to invest in relationships and lost relationships as they moved along. And with all of that investment, there's also the investment of ego. They've put not only their time and their money, but their self-worth on the line. You know, nobody likes to be evaluated. Nobody likes to be judged. And you go to a test and you find out that you failed, and you keep finding out you failed. It's hard to not believe after a while that you're a failure, isn't it? And so the result of all of this is that we get this hardening of the attitudes. You know, what begins to happen is that when there's no change in results, when you keep going back and hitting the same wall over and over and over again, you just come to expect that that's what's going to happen. And the result for many people is not just frustrating, it's just maddening to them. And so they become like my friend here, the hamster in the wheel. They just keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, but knowing that it's not likely that it's going to happen. And because of that, the frustration level becomes greater and greater. And yet there's no change in results. They go in, they take the exam, they fail it. They go in, they take the exam, and they fail it, and so on. And so we find ourselves literally in a pit of despair. And how do you get out of that? What do you do? Well, we're going to show you how to do that in a minute, but I want to further describe this position of despair because I think it's important to recognize if you're feeling it, that you're not alone. And I think the more I can describe it, the more you may recognize that if I can describe it, it may be something that's not unique just to you. I think that there's language, habits, and evidence that show us each of these stages along the way as we go from despair to hope, to belief, and then finally to expectation. And at the despair level, I think one of the things that begins to happen is that we see language that's negative, lots of nots and can'ts and won'ts and haven't and don't want to, kind of like dealing with a 4-year-old, right? I don't want to eat that. I want to go here. I don't want to take my nap. I'm not going to do this, right? It's pretty amazing to hear that. But you hear it from adults who really feel like they are just fed up. They're not going any further. And so there's a lot of negative language. And if you've been using a lot of negative language lately, I can't pass the bar. I never seem to be able to do this. I'm unable to memorize. I'm unable to spot issues. That kind of negative language would indicate some level of despair. There's also what I would describe as indecisive language. You know, this is the language of people that just can't quite figure out what to do. Should I do this? Should I try that? Lots of questioning, but not much in the way of answers. And the net result of that indecisive language is sort of wandering around trying to plaintively look for some help, but not knowing where to find it. And so the language becomes very indecisive, very unsure. Should I take the bar exam? Maybe I should wait another year. Should I switch jurisdictions? Those are all the kinds of questions we hear from people who are experiencing some level of despair. And then, as I say, there are habits. And the habits of someone who's in despair, I think, are a couple of different extremes, actually. One extreme is the procrastination manic continuum. At one end of this is procrastination. You just can't make a decision. I see this all the time. People come to me and they acknowledge, like our friend the hamster here, that they're not making any progress. They're doing the same thing over and over again. They're expecting a different result. And yet, when you present them with a way out, they just can't seem to decide. And it's not because it costs so much or it takes so much. It's because they're just so firmly convinced that they can't be successful, that making any decision puts them at risk of failing again. And so procrastination becomes the go-to. If you've been procrastinating about what to do with your bar studies, you're probably in that point of despair. Now, the other end of that continuum is our hamster when it's running. It's the manic behavior. And the manic behavior is the person that just literally tries to grab onto everything. I'm going to do everything. I'm going to have everything. If you've got one webinar, I'll attend it 10 times. If you've got one ebook, I'll order it, but I'll order everybody's book. I'll do everything. I've had students who say to me, I've done 5,000 multi-state questions, as if that's some badge of honor. It's not. It's really purposeless kind of just running around. And it literally reminds me of the hamster in the wheel. And so I think for a lot of people, the manic behavior is just as bad as the procrastination. It's just as ineffective. And then somewhere maybe in the middle between those two is what I would call obstructive behavior. These are the people that basically, or metaphorically, or even literally, cross their arms and say, I'm not going to do anything. You can't make me. Well, of course we can't make you. All we can do is suggest. All we can do is advise and help. But there are people who are so angry because they're in this point of despair that they literally believe everyone is out to get them. And these are the folks that come to us as a bar review, assuming the worst, assuming that we're going to cheat them or trick them, or that in some way we're bad or dishonest or mean. None of those things are true. Certainly after 30 years and thousands of students, our reputation is pretty well set. But the reality is that for people who believe that everyone is out to get them, then they don't trust their law school, they don't trust the bar examiners, they don't trust the bar review, they don't trust anybody or anything. And frankly, these are people that are pretty tough to live with. Maybe you've been that person for a while. Maybe you've noticed that other people avoid you. They don't want to be around you, that you've taken on so much negativity in your life that everything is wrong, everything is bad. And if that's been happening, I think that's a sign of despair, and you should be aware of it. And then lastly, we have the evidence of despair. I think the most common evidence of despair is simply the person that keeps doing the same thing, expecting a different result, and then they get the bad results. The people that take the exam and fail, and take the exam and fail, and take the exam and fail, and nothing really changes in the way they study. They take the same approach, they use the same techniques, they do the same thing in the same time period. How in the world would you expect to get a different result if you're doing the same thing over and over again? The bar examiners are actually quite proud of the fact that they have consistent outputs for consistent inputs. That's what they call it. If you study the same way and you approach the exam the same way, the bar examiners believe you should get the same result time after time after time. That's not because they're being mean or vicious or evil. It's just a reality of good standardized testing. You want tests to produce predictable results for predictable inputs. And yet bar takers don't seem to realize this. I've had people that come to me and say, well, I failed by 3 points or 4 points or 5 points. And I say, what are you going to do differently? And they say, well, nothing. I'm just going to study harder. Studying harder doesn't change that result. They'll still pass, or they'll still fail by 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 points. The exam is designed to return the same result. And so if you want something different, you've got to do something different. And that's really hard for people to do. But the evidence flies in the face of that belief that somehow miraculously it'll change. It doesn't. If anything, the evidence right now points towards lower pass rates. Repeat bar takers have a pass rate in some jurisdictions as low as 10 to 15%. That's right, you heard that right, 10 to 15%. And the more times you take the bar, the lower the percentage rate of passing is going to be. And so if you're in that circumstance, you simply don't have the luxury of just doing the same old thing over and over and over again. And so you are literally at that point in the hamster cage, running on the wheel and in despair. So how do you get out of that? How do you get from that horrible feeling to the beginning of a new day? I live in a really beautiful place. This is a picture behind me of a lake behind our home. And I really love the fact that as the sun comes up over the trees, we have the opportunity to start each day with some degree of hope. And I think that for bar takers, finding that bridge or that path to hope becomes critically important. So a couple of things that I think start you on that road. The first is to be aware of the stories of others. We realized a few years ago that one of the most powerful things we could do to help other people was to get our passing successful students on video talking about their own experience. It wasn't about what we did to help them, it was about what they did. It was about their journey and their path. And the stories are incredibly powerful, and we've got them on our website, and we'll put a link in it, a link to those here. But the beautiful part of those stories is that they're all unique and individual. And yet at the same time, they've got some common factors. They're people who were struggling, were challenged by the bar exam in lots of different ways and found ways to overcome it. They found ways to find the bridge to hope, and then ultimately to belief, and then on to expectation. And it's great to see their stories. If you've been feeling some degree of despair about your bar study, one of the best things you can do is watch some of those videos. It doesn't really matter which one. I think right now, as I'm recording this, we've got over 75 of those videos on our site, and they're all kinds of people from all different jurisdictions, all walks of life, all kinds of experiences. So pick one or two and watch them, or just sample a few of them, and I think you'll be amazed with what you can hear from others. And those stories can act as a bridge to hope for you. Now, in addition to the stories of others, I think that one of the things you have to do is to decide and make a conscious decision to open yourself up to new approaches. How can you do things differently? What is out there that might assist you in being more successful on the exam? One of the things that's most surprising to me is how rigid we are, that we learn things in school, and then we believe that's the only way that you can learn. But the truth is that learning is an ongoing effort in life, and learning should be something that translates and transforms itself and becomes dynamic rather than static. And so our approach to bar review is to create new ways to learn, to help people with new approaches. One of the other things that I think a bar review needs to do is to analyze the layout of the test, the layout of the land. You know, the test is not testing the same things today that it used to test. The bar exam doesn't test memorization. It doesn't test issue spotting. It doesn't test the recitation of elements and rules. Why? Because those things aren't necessary for the practice of law anymore. The practice of law requires judgment and discernment. It requires the ability to take the law that's readily available and easily accessible and apply it to the problems of your clients. And that skill is what the bar examiners have been testing now for many years. But the truth is, law schools and big box bar reviews have never adapted to that. And so if you continue to use an approach that's probably better suited to Abraham Lincoln when he was reading the law to take the bar exam, or even John Adams, who read the law, you're really missing out. That's the wrong set of skills for the test that's being offered today. Instead, what you want to be able to do is to focus on new skills, focus on how to write clearly and concisely, how to identify disputes and show how the law applies to those disputes, show how to organize your thoughts around coherent ideas, and then use the law to support those ideas. Learn the principles of law that control fact patterns in a multiple choice question without memorizing and reciting elements. And there are new approaches to all of those things, things that we've been doing in some cases for a decade or more here, but are still very revolutionary in the field of bar review. If you've been feeling despair, one of the ways that you can move to hope is by finding these new approaches, finding the things that resonate. I hear from students every week who say, I was hearing or watching your video or listening to a podcast and heard about you talking about the approach that you're taking, and it just made sense to me. Well, of course, it is common sense, most of it. But if it makes sense to you, then it gives you hope as well, and it gives you a reason to do something different. Look, doing the same thing over and over and over again, assuming it'll give you a different result, is not going to lead you to hope. It's only going to cause you to be in more despair. Well, along with these new approaches, I think one of the things that brings hope to people is that we've got better learning and study tools today than we ever had before. You know, when we first started teaching bar review, the only way people learned was they went to a classroom course for 6 weeks and they listened to a lecture and a professor drone on in a specialized subject, and then they did a handful of questions and they went and took the exam. That was the bad news. The good news was the bar exam was easier and most people passed. Well, today the exam is much, much tougher because it doesn't just test those simple rote rules. And as a result, you need new approaches, as I said, but you need better tools. Now, in our course, we've incorporated a number of those tools. Things like photo reading and paraliminals come to mind immediately. Photo reading is a way to read an outline in 15 minutes that would have taken you 6 to 8 hours and to have 75% recall of the material. And it's not magic, and it's not a fake, and it's not a gimmick. It's been something that's been out there for nearly 25 years now, and we've incorporated it into the bar review successfully for 10 years. And when you listen to the stories of our students that I was talking about earlier, you'll hear a number of them mention photo reading as a tool that really changed their world. It moved their scores up by 10, 20, 30 points, 70 points or more. Why? Because it takes advantage of what we know about how people learn, takes advantage of what we know about neuroscience and the neurology of education. It takes advantage of our ability to really work to the things that matter when it comes to teaching and learning. And it's a great tool. Why wouldn't you want to use it? Paraliminals are another of those tools. They help us literally speak to the non-conscious mind, to program ourselves, if you will, in positive ways, to help bridge the gap between despair and hope, for example, by just listening to a recording for 15 or 20 minutes and then moving on. It's very simple, but incredibly powerful and effective. Meditation is something that's been around for a very, very long time, but technology has made it even more accessible and even easier. Now you can just put on a pair of headphones or an earbud, listen to a recording for half an hour or an hour, and it creates new synaptic connections, new neural pathways, ways that you can literally equal the meditation of a Buddhist monk who's been practicing for decades. You have that ability within days or weeks. And the great advantage of meditation is well known, but it really makes study more effective and makes it more practical. And now it's accessible, and it's a tool that we incorporate as well. So there's lots of those kinds of tools available. That's not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's 3 of the tools that we consistently see making a difference for our students. I think that those things all create this bridge to hope that we were talking about. Something else that I think makes a difference in the bridge to hope is literally beginning to recognize that what you want here is information and not propaganda or marketing. You know, I'm very jealous and very envious of the big box bar reviews. They spend more on marketing in a week than I would spend in a lifetime. And they're good at it. They're incredibly good at it. And they've convinced literally thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of bar students that the only way to study is the same old way that's been used for years and years and years, even though the empirical evidence is that most people fail the exam. Most people that use issue spotting, memorization, big box approaches fail the bar exam. The majority fail. And yet those big box companies continue to go out and spend a fortune on swag and gifts and marketing and convince the students in school that the only way to pass the bar is to take this course that doesn't work. Now, it's interesting to me to go back to the story of the publisher. I don't know why we're not one of the best bar reviews for first-time takers. I suppose it's because I don't try to advertise to first-time takers. But I'll tell you that when I've got a first-time taker, they pass. It's not all that difficult. But if you're not a first-time taker, and you've been feeling this sense of despair and you want some hope, well, one of the ways is to get some information. Find out the truth about what the bar review is and not just believe the propaganda that's out there. Is it powerful? Yep. Is it fake? Yeah, most of it's fake news. Is most of it just crazy marketing? Yeah, but it's really effective, and it really gets people to believe that that's what they should do. Look, when you're getting your information about how to take the bar exam from a third-year law student who's never taken the bar exam, you got to be a little suspicious, don't you? All right. Now, when people begin to move into this new moment of the bridge to hope, I think that one of the things we start to see is that they're beginning to open up. They're not all the way there, but they're beginning to open up to the possibility that there are other things going on. And I hear that when people contact me, when they talk to me, when they ask questions. I hear in their questions, instead of a defiance, a sense of optimism and hopefulness. There's what I would call cautious optimism. Maybe, and it's just like that sun peeking over the cloud, maybe, just maybe I could do it. Maybe this will be what changes things for me. Maybe there's a way around this. Maybe there's a way to get my life back. And if you're feeling that, if you feel like maybe this could work, I want you to go with that. I want you to trust that and let it grow, let it nurture just a little bit. And you know, what we then begin to see when people come into a course like ours and they start to work is that they have small gains. They start to get better at taking questions. I had a student the other day who said, you know, I just did 25 questions in constitutional law. I got 21 of them correct. That's never happened to me in my life before, but using photo reading and paraliminals, the approach that we teach in Celebration, she said, for the first time, I'm actually able to get questions correct. And she had taken the bar many, many times before. When you start to get those small gains, you start to move from despair into hopefulness. You start to believe that maybe there's a chance that you could do this. And you begin to gain momentum. And with that momentum, it looks like it could be possible. And that momentum is incredibly powerful and incredibly important. I think for a lot of people, they feel stuck when they're in despair. The biggest difference between despair and hope is the sense of momentum. I'm making progress. I'm moving towards a goal. I'm not stuck in the same old rut. Once you begin to understand that you don't have to be stuck, so many things can change. Well, that's a little bit of a description of this movement from despair to hope. And I hope that it gives you some sense of where you might be and what's available. Now, in a later video, we're going to talk about the move and the bridge from hope to belief. That's an important bridge. And then we'll wrap up with the bridge from belief to expectation. And once you've been through all three bridges, I think you'll begin to realize that this is really the process that you have to follow in order to pass the bar exam. I look forward to seeing you along that bridge, seeing you somewhere out on that bridge as you move from one step to the next. And I hope that this has given you some information that you can use to start on your journey to leave despair and to move towards hope.